Hey everybody, so we're going to take a look at some rapier fencing that I do and analyze some of the choices that I'm making and why the heck do I do them. Like, is this historical rapier? Is this just like purely modern stuff that I'm doing? So this is our open house. You're going to see some people kind of blocking it at times, but I picked out ones where the action's clear in them. First thing we're going to take a look at is I'm fencing somebody who does a pretty normal capo ferro style there. So the first thing that I do is an arm touch. So is that historical? The first time I was really exposed to arm touches in Rapier, because I mostly went deep target, that's the way that I was taught, was really at WMAW. I think it was 2018. I had done like a year of foil before that, but quite a few years of historical rapier fencing. And it was Kevin Murakoshi kept on tagging me on the arm in rapier. I didn't really have a good defense for it. So one of the things that I started doing was I switched over to epee at that point and started working more on arm touches. So I started looking at historical sources and wondering about the forward target. Now, for a full breakdown of this, my friend Jim Emmons did a really excellent article about the forward target in small sword and rapier sources. But basically, what you end up finding is in all the beginning sections of the books, they talk about holding a good position that defends the arm from thrust. So even though in the plays, while you don't see a ton of arm thrust, it was a deep concern for people, and that's one of the reasons why they wanted to protect it from having a sword pierce their arm. So anytime you're holding a little bit of a bad guard, so here his terza wasn't great. It was a little bit too centered. So I noticed that he kept on bringing it center. So what I did was I started on the inside and I disengaged to the outside there. Here we go. So I started inside, disengaged to the outside, and I just tagged them by the elbow. So just a classic touch whenever somebody's arm is just a little bit too inside. So that's the use of the forward target. Now I don't always do it, but if I notice an error, I'm going to hit you there. The next one we're going to take a look at is funny. Leg cut to the outside of the leg. So is that rapier fencing, or am I just doing broadsword? The answer is it's rapier fencing. I started doing that from Alfieri. When I went through Alfieri, what I noticed was there was a ton of leg cuts. Even in the single sword section, he often shows a leg cut as a riposte. So after you've parried something, you riposte to the leg, or as a feint. So you feint high. In this case, I ended up feinting high. So my sword point was up. I noticed that he was thinking it was coming in the high line. He had kind of dropped his guard. And then I start a little bit of a beginning of to raise the sword in moulinet, cut to the outside of the leg. Now those things are powerful. They get a ton of whip on them, and it sounds like a cannon when it hits the shin guard. Historically, that was a good target, especially if they weren't wearing really high, thick boots. It was a target to the shins. Like in Alfieri, they're wearing smaller shoes, to the shin, to the knee, or depending on the pants they're wearing, if they're tighter pants or less layers, cutting to the thigh. The other person you would want to take a look at for that is Pasha. Pasha has a ton of cuts, and he shows how cuts were used in rapier. If you look at some of the historical documentation, while they taught thrust fencing at the schools, they said almost all of the street brawls, they ended up being people throwing cuts at each other. So cuts were a big part of rapier fencing. You see that in the cuts section of Pasha. You also see that in Alfieri. So don't reduce it to just what a few masters, some of the main masters say. Rapier is a really big thing, right? And so take bits and pieces that you like that work for you. So you can see me being patient there. And what I do is as he attacks me, I just open up the distance a little bit because we were getting a little bit close there. And when you parry, you want it to be like a couple inches past your guard, right? So just back up, get out of there. But I noticed that he kind of hangs out closer than he should after he made that attack, right? So when somebody's close, one of the great attacks is a flush, right? Because it's sudden and surprising, and it's actually it's best as a close distance attack. So you can see, boom, I flash with a disengage and hit him. So is that historical? And the answer is yes. You see a ton of that. So one example of that is if you take a look at the second book of Fabris, you're going to see a ton of kind of like these drive, run by attacks, right? Where people are passing forward, putting pressure, and boom, hit with like a counter attack or with a disengage. Into the other opponent. So you see a ton of these running attacks, right? So that's definitely a part of the system. Later on, somebody would explicitly say it like Hope, where he talks about running attacks as called the full pass, and other authors talk about it too in small sword and rapier sources. But anyway, so those three things that we looked at, forward target, cuts to the leg, and the flesh, they're all found in historical sources. So the final thing I want to take a look at here is kind of the stance. So rather than using, you can see my friend Nick here is in a really good capo ferro stance, back weighted, sometimes almost a straight leg as he gets into it. Yeah, there you go. You can see it. He almost has a straight knee like they do in the historical sources, right? Whereas if you can see me here, I'm just in a relaxed, natural kind of stance. So why do I do that? Why did I start doing that? It actually wasn't from modern fencing. One of the big critiques, because when I started doing modern fencing, my fencing coach said it was totally fine if I use a rear weighted stance. In fact, he kind of taught that a lot of the time in classical French fencing. It'd be just slightly to the rear, right? I adopted this because of historical broadsword sources. So broadsword and small sword. So it was Godfrey who wrote, I think it was 1745. I think he was, no, it might have been 1747. I think he was the year after Thomas Page wrote his in 46. So he wrote a critique of the gladiator style of fighting. And one of the things that he said was that having a rear-weighted stance was really, really bad. And you see people not being mobile with it, not being able to move around. He recommended a 50-50 split. So I started taking that a little bit more seriously. And Burton kind of did the same thing later on when he was critiquing Angelo. So that back-weighted stance, it's really slow and clunky for people. Whereas you can see I'm using pretty dynamic changing footwork. It's easy for me to change directions, use false steps, come forward and everything. Whereas it's clunky for somebody to be in a rear-weighted stance. It's just not as fast, right? So that's one of the things. And you can say that there are people that are good at it. There are people that load up that lunge on the rear-weighted stance, but by and by the trade-off is too big. And that actually comes from historical fencing, my critique of that, right? So if you put it together, all of these things are really historical things that I've been criticized for, but they were choices that I made because they function really well in the setting that I'm using it in. And they were also brought up in the past as critiques of what was going on, or even just as things that maybe sometimes people look past because they might not necessarily be in plays, or there's some myths around things like leg cuts, like they're not effective when they really, really are a good tool to add to the toolkit.